I'm Shannon Torrens. I'm a human rights and international lawyer from Sydney, Australia, and I'm chairing the panel today. So our panel's on a range of really interesting issues relating to the Middle East, Palestine, and we're privileged to have these two fantastic speakers here today. And so each of our presenters is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. And it would be great to get your engagement at that point. So firstly, we have Anthony Oberschall, and he is from the University of North Carolina, and he's going to be speaking on the contours of an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement. You have the floor.
Thank you. Of course, nobody's under any illusions about obstacles to an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, but sometimes ideas that are far-fetched become in time actionable. I remember 1960s and 70s, how we talked about South Africa and how it was going to end up in a violent conflagration. And then, of course, it didn't happen. I also remember the long history of German Franco bloody wars and everything else. And then there was post-World War II cooperation developing into the European Union, and nobody expected that. And I actually lived in France for a while, and I know what animosity there was towards Germans, and 30 years later they were welcome as tourists and people buying summer homes, you know, in their little towns and so on. So I'm just saying these ideas take a long time, but they're, I think, not unrealistic, what I'm going to say. Now, the guiding idea I have is that Israel has an interest in a viable Palestinian neighbor, if there's going to be two states, and not a failed state that's taken over by, militants and religious fanatics and so on. So Israel has actually an interest in developing a relationship with the Palestinians if it can assure its security. Now, I looked at 1970s and 80s data, and before the first Intifada, about 1/3 of the Palestinian workforce was employed in Israel itself. Even nowadays, there are 80,000 work permits issued to Palestinians to work in Israel, and thousands more Palestinians work there illegally in Israeli settlements. About 120,000 Palestinian workers commute to Israel every day, through checkpoints on a daily commute. Just 3 weeks ago, the Palestinian Prime Minister and the Israeli Finance Minister have announced a plan to develop 3 joint industrial free trade zones in the West Bank. So the economic incentives and a sort of a natural economic common market exists in Palestine and would develop if there was political peace there. So that's one guiding idea. The second one is that for a peace agreement, the adversaries have to negotiate in earnest, and for that they must bear the full costs of the conflict. Now, for decades, the Israelis and Palestinians have outsourced the costs of their conflict to international community and to their allies, who have become essentially enablers to this conflict. For Palestinians, that means phasing out the billions of international subsidies by virtue of their refugee status, and of course phasing in a viable economy. For the Israelis, it means bearing the full costs of being occupiers, military occupiers in a territory that doesn't belong to them under international law, and that means including paying rent to the Palestinian authorities for the settlements they don't vacate. I'll develop these ideas further. The peace agreement, if there is one, has to achieve a better future and a realistic future for both adversaries compared to the status quo, which means very sound security for Israel and a viable economic future for the Palestinians. The third idea is that that really means that two states, Israel and Palestine, a Palestinian state defined along the Green Line boundary, 1967 armistice line, if you wish, a neutral and demilitarized Palestinian state with joint secure agreements, like a Switzerland, okay? A right of return exchange for financial compensation, which will be paid for by the rents that Israel pays for having the settlements, among other things. Building a normal state for the Palestinians in view of their failed institutions of the moment, which means some kind of a common economic, I wouldn't say a common market, but certainly an integrated economic area that benefits both people, and institutions for Jerusalem, making it one city, two capitals, that avoids kind of the East Berlin, West Berlin separation of one city into two parts. And I'll get into these things a little more detail, but that's the basic idea. Now, the obstacles to peace are that the Israelis believe that an independent Palestine state will be weak and a failed state and not able to prevent attacks on Israel, as has been the Gaza experience, and that their security will require Israel to re-invade the Palestinian areas and resume military occupation because they don't get any security from there. So a genuine peace process might precipitate civil strife among the Palestinians, as happened in Gaza when Hamas ousted Fatah by violence, and result in a hostile, unstable state controlled by religious and nationalist extremists. Of course, Israel can't put up with that in a new state that's forming. So as a result of that, the status quo is preferable for Israel. Now, the Palestinians believe that an Israeli government will not be able to or willing to deliver on East Jerusalem as their capital and to evacuate many of the West Bank settlements because the armed settlers and their allies will resist the Israeli defense forces. Israelis shooting one another is, not a future for Israel. And so Palestine will remain a Swiss cheese entity with limited sovereignty. In any case, so for them also, plus they're being financed by outsiders, so the status quo is preferable for the Palestinians. So with two status quos being preferable and being financed by outsiders, you're not going to have any progress towards peace. Now, what would the future look like that you want to establish there? Of course, Israel is a permanent state and will remain a Jewish state. Palestinians are permanent and will not be a quasi-colony of Israel, and they will not be just ethnically cleansed into other Arab states. The reality, too, is that Israel is an occupying power in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, and has to assume responsibilities of a military occupier. It's outsourced that to the international community. Reality 3, the Palestinians must end their unparalleled status as the oldest unsettled refugee population in UN history and the largest per capita recipient of foreign aid worldwide. So they must become a normal state, not a dependent state on outsiders with a viable economy. And fourth, the end of the peace process should be a peace agreement by two sovereign states, Israel and Palestinian state, endorsed by the international community and ratified by a majority of voters of both states. Now, very briefly, I'm not going to go into describing the subsidies and that the Palestinians have received by way of their being the 50 years refugee population. I think I will only note that, especially in Gaza, 80% of the population rely on humanitarian aid, mostly food. UNRWA operates one of the largest Middle East school systems for Palestinians. 500,000 students, pays 70% of the teaching staff. It's essentially amounts to $750 per annum. And also it maintains one of the largest public health systems for a population. None of that is paid by the Palestinians. It all comes from the outside. It's a huge, huge subsidy. U.S., by the way, from all different sources, pays about $650 million a year in all forms of assistance to the Palestinians. That's from the Congressional Research Service. Now, outsourcing of this aid is actually coming from the Arab states, who not just the current administration and the Europeans having some second thoughts, but the Arab states have been unwilling to really meet their financial obligations that they subscribe to keep this whole thing going. What I'm saying is that my proposal just means regularizing and giving a timetable to this, a realistic timetable to this process. Now, what about the obligations of Israel to assume the responsibilities of occupation? Under the Geneva Convention, the occupying power does not acquire ownership of immovable public property in occupied territory, and the transfer of civilian populations by the occupying power into occupied territory is illegal. So essentially, the settlements are illegal. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that any peace agreement that Israel signs, it will be unwilling to vacate 600,000 settlers. So my view is that what the Palestinian state should demand is rent payment for the territories, the space that is occupied by the Israeli settlers. Interestingly, Professor Ben Meir has told me this morning that Israel is already doing something like that. Since the '67 war, it has paid Jordan rent for agricultural land that it leases from the Palestinians along the Jordan River. So this idea is not totally weird or kooky. But in any case, what happens to the to the settlement that are leased? You could probably make an agreement saying that Israeli law and authority would continue in them. The leases would be, 50 years, long-term leases, and Could be all kinds of arrangements about whether or not any back pay is owed to them and so on. I don't want to go into that. Now, what would happen to this money? It would go not into the pockets of Palestinian politicians, but into funds. And one of the funds would be a fund managed by or supervised by international bodies to compensate Palestinian refugees for the right of return. Now, the opinion polls show that 80% of the Palestinians think that's an acceptable idea for them to trade the right of return, which is just, off in the future, nowhere, for something tangible like a financial compensation. And yes, and that would happen here. And some of the other funds would be set up to phase in financing for a Palestinian state as you phase out the international aid that's outsourced and so on. I have details in my paper, including figures from a RAND study of what it would take to invest here to make the Palestinian state viable. The second thing is security. Security arrangements and enforcement, including decommissioning of weapons, international inspection, a dignified demilitarization of militants, as in South Africa and Northern Ireland and Colombia, release of prisoners held by Israel, and a declaration of both sides to the cessation of hostilities. And the fighters could enlist in a trading violence for jobs program. I mean, you have to get jobs for the guys who've been digging tunnels in Gaza, right? So that's the second part. Jerusalem needs a special paper. Here, all I will say is that there have been some interesting think tank initiatives by both, especially Israelis, but Palestinians. Especially, I'm thinking of Daniel Seidman. Terrestrial Jerusalem is one of them. Of how this would work out so it doesn't become a West Berlin, East Berlin situation. Finally, recognition of the neutrality of the Palestinian state. So you remove all offensive weapons, but you also make it a neutral state like Switzerland and Sweden, which they agreed to, and which the surrounding states and the Gulf states agreed to recognize as Swiss and Swedish neutrality are recognized. Then, when all of these things are in place, there's a phased withdrawal of the IDF, an assumption of responsibility of security by the Palestinian police, which it now shares with the Israelis. And what you want to see now develop in a more peaceful fashion is two states who have been partially integrated for decades economically would develop more of this so that it becomes an integrated situation with a viable Israeli and Palestinian benefiting both. You need agreements on the flow of goods and people, transportation, currency, official languages, religious life, law courts, education, and so on. And this could all be part of a larger peace package. And finally, you have a peace settlement that between Israel and the new Palestinian states that has to be approved by all the stakeholders, all the international major powers and other Arab stakeholders, and which are legitimized by referenda in Israel and Palestine. So these are sort of guiding ideas, something to look for. I think the problem has been that incremental tinkering with settlements and boundaries did not give the people in these two countries a vision of what could be done, and I think that is what these ideas are supposed to accomplish. Obviously, these are rough ideas and first ideas, but I believe if they're well worked out, they can, as in South Africa and in post-war Western Europe, make for a future that both sides agree is better than the kind of a stalemate that they're in, and it might sort of catch on. I'm all done. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. So now we have our next speaker, Andrew Wickersham, and he's from Churches for the Middle East Peace, and he will be speaking on building consensus on Middle East politics. Thank you.
So continuing the theme of conflict resolution in the Middle East, I'd like to address the role that coalition building plays in that process. And I think regardless of whether we're looking at Israel-Palestine or Syria and Yemen, creating coalitions of unlikely allies is going to play a major part in resolving those conflicts. And we'd like to offer our own organizational example of how we've developed coalitions as a relevant, applicable example to those other conflicts as well. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about our organization and what the nature of our work is, address some of the challenges that we face, which is, I imagine, are fairly significant, and then the approaches that we've taken to address those challenges. So Churches for Middle East Peace works to mobilize U.S. Christians to be advocates of equality, human rights, security, and justice for Israelis, Palestinians, and all other peoples in the Middle East. And in order to mobilize such broad-based support within the diverse landscape of Christianity in the United States, we have to work with a wide array of denominations, ranging from Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, mainline Protestant, and evangelicals. Since 1984, CMEP has been working with its coalition members to help church organizations, leaders, and individuals nationwide express their concerns about justice and peace for all peoples in the region. CMEP believes that American Christians have a responsibility for holding our political leaders accountable for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and that we affirm a sound and holistic U.S. foreign policy is necessary for achieving and maintaining just and stable relationships within the region. So advocacy work on this scale is obviously not without its challenges, and the four primary issues that we face as an organization are the complexities of coalition work, the challenges of ecumenical engagement, obviously the very nature of Middle East foreign policy, and then the related issue of U.S. domestic policies that influence that. Each of these in and of itself is a daunting task, and we believe that the fact that we face all four makes us a unique example of how broad coalition building can succeed. So as an organization, we maintain that all organizational policy has to be reached through consensus. And consensus does not mean unanimous agreement of all 27 of our coalition members. It simply means that each of our board members has to agree on a policy decision before we can proceed with it. This has the strength of lending each coalition decision the maximum amount of legitimacy and stability possible. But as you can imagine, there are also challenges that go along with building consensus. And regardless of the organization, consensus building is always going to be vulnerable to a number of obstacles that can potentially lead to dysfunction. One of them is the tendency of coalition members to compete with each other and to promote their own individual interests at the expense of the larger organizational objectives. And this can be exacerbated by mistrust if there's the perception within the coalition that there are divergent and non-reconcilable interests present within that group. And obviously these issues of mistrust are complicated by the very messy history of the Christian church. As previously mentioned, CMF Churches for Middle East Peace, is our coalition members consist of Orthodox, Catholic, mainline, Protestant, and evangelical members. And while all of these groups affirm the traditional tenets of Christianity, there are numerous doctrinal divisions among our coalition. Just off the top of my head, there are at least 3 different views of how church governance should operate. There are differences on theology involving sacraments, or whether sacraments even exist at all. There are disputes over what the fundamental doctrinal authorities need to be, including the nature of the Bible. And then there are even more minute technical matters like free will versus predestination, and of course eschatology. So it is truly a marvel, given the history of all these theological disputes, that ecumenical movements work at all. But within the last century or so, there's been a lot of work towards building dialogue between different church denominations. But what we think is so remarkable about Churches for Middle East Peace is that our core issue that is uniting all of our diverse theologies together is Middle East foreign policy, which is not exactly the easiest issue to build consensus on. Each of our coalition members has their own institutional history of involvement in the Middle East. For instance, some of our coalition members are the American extensions of indigenous churches in the Middle East, including the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Apostolic Church, as well as the Untitled Orthodox Church and the Latin Patriarchate of the Holy Land. Each of these churches represent the interests of the Middle East diaspora community here in the United States. Then, in contrast, we also have our mainline Protestant denominations that have been active in the Middle East since at least the 19th century and have significant followings there as a result of evangelistic outreach. But then we have other churches that within the last 50 years or so are just starting to get involved in the region and have comparatively fewer local followers. And this difference in on-the-ground presence affects the way that different church denominations relate to local governments in the Middle East, which will obviously have a significant bearing on their own strategic vision on how to resolve conflict, especially if you have a significant following in Israel and the Palestinian territories. You're going to be more reluctant to be openly hostile against the governing authorities that you rely on for security. But perhaps the greatest point of theological divergence among our coalition members is on the subject of violence and the legitimacy of violence as a means of either averting a humanitarian crisis or preventing further conflict. Historically, since the time of Augustine, Christians have adhered to a theory of just warfare. And according to this doctrine, warfare is only permissible if and only if 3 conditions are met. And those conditions are that the war must be in self-defense, that it must produce fewer casualties than if it didn't occur, and if no civilians are harmed in the process. However, there are other Christians that maintain that pacifism is the most literal interpretation of Christ's teachings. And then recently, a third position has emerged known as just peacemaking, which rather than simply addressing the ethics of participating in a violent conflict, they seek to proactively eliminate the causes of violence through nonviolent direct action. And then within the framework of U.S. Christianity, we also have the complex subject of Christian Zionism. Within Christianity, especially Protestantism, there are diverse opinions on the role of the Jewish people within Christian doctrine, and in particular whether they remain the chosen people of God and whether covenantal promises still tie them to the Holy Land. And even within a coalition that's committed to achieving a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, there are still considerable components that adhere to Christian Zionism as a biblical position. And consequently, theology is going to have a direct bearing on how our different coalition members approach what should constitute just U.S. foreign policy. But obviously, the moment that you engage on the issue of foreign policy, churches find themselves in the political realm, and thus U.S. domestic policies are going to have a bearing on their stances on foreign policy issues. Within the CMEP coalition, our group is ideologically all over the U.S. political spectrum, and according to a 2016 Pew survey of political views of religious groups in the United States, the United Church of Christ and the Unitarian Universalists are some of the most reliable Democrat voting groups in the United States. Other mainline groups such as the Episcopalians, Methodists, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America tend to have very liberal leadership and clergy members, but far more ideological diversity among the actual churchgoers themselves. And then among Catholic and Orthodox Christians, these groups are almost evenly divided between conservative and liberal members. And then, not surprisingly, CMEP's evangelical supporters tend to be conservative in their political leanings. Given the highly polarized environment of contemporary U.S. politics, it should not be a surprise that American Christians are equally divided when it comes to both domestic and foreign politics. And considering that both groups like to use theological justifications to support their political views, this can create even a higher degree of polarization among the religious community than among the secular community. So given these four challenges of coalition governance, ecumenical engagement, Middle East foreign policy, and U.S. domestic politics, how does CMEP manage to build a coalition consensus across such a broad spectrum? We found that two principles are particularly effective for achieving this type of consensus. The first is what I'm going to term constructive conflict, and that's creating a communication environment where parties are comfortable airing their disagreements with each other. And then secondly, this constructive conflict should in turn produce a unifying set of organizational principles that provide clarity of purpose. So as counterintuitive as it seems, constructive conflict is actually the key to building consensus. Given the very real differences among our members that I have addressed earlier, it would be completely counterproductive if we were to pretend these differences didn't exist. It is in fact essential to create an environment where our partners are comfortable in discussing their disagreements with each other, and in turn this requires trust and mutual respect. In the case of CMEP, it is vital that all of our members believe that each other are committed to the goal of building a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. And once parties are comfortable with entering into constructive conflict with each other, it's possible to determine where we are in complete agreement with each other, where we're close to agreement, and where there is complete divergence of opinion. And from there we can determine where we need to be in fundamental agreement with each other and what other issues are completely tangential to organizational success. And so from this process of determination, we can arrive at core policy decisions. And I'd like to use two particular issues to illustrate how this process works. The first is the question of whether to engage, or whether all violence is illegitimate. And the second is whether the church should engage in the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, which has been increasingly active in trying to resolve the issue of the occupation. So on the question of the legitimacy of violence, CMUP's official position is that we call for the negotiated, just, and peaceful resolutions to conflicts in the region and the demilitarization of conflict. This language carefully articulates a point of convergence that all three Christian philosophies on war can agree on. This is not a statement endorsing just warfare, but neither is it a pacifist statement either. It merely acknowledges that the ultimate goal of peacemaking is the gradual demilitarization of conflict through diplomatic negotiation. Likewise, on the issue of boycott, divest, and sanctions, CMUP is officially neutral. Many of our coalition members are actively involved in a full boycott of Israel. Others only engage in a boycott of companies that profit from the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And then others refrain from any boycott actions altogether. And as a result, CMUP addresses this by pledging to uphold the right of churches and organizations to find appropriate and various ways to end unjust practices and policies that violate international law, including the use of economic leverage on commercial and government actors. So once again, this policy language is precisely worded in order to articulate a position that is amenable to everyone within the coalition. This language does not endorse the BDS movement, nor does CMUP participate in it, but we are completely adamant in affirming that churches have the right to engage in BDS if they feel that that is the most appropriate and productive means of ending the occupation. And we concur with the recent statements by the American Civil Liberties Union that BDS is a right of free speech and democratic liberty. And as an organization, we've worked very hard to oppose federal laws that would limit churches to be able to engage in this type of activity. So crucially, in both of these cases, none of our coalition members were forced to set aside their deeply held beliefs in order to participate. Rather than trying to find points of compromise, we've simply arrived at kind of the lowest common denominator of agreement among our coalition members. In the case of just warfare, those who hold just warfare theories can continue to participate in our coalition, as can pacifists. And those who support BDS can continue to do so with CMUP support, and those who abstain can do so without judgment. Once again, the goal is not to arrive at a compromise and force churches to change their position, but merely to find out what the basic level of agreement that we all share is. And in this manner, we are able to arrive at our 13 policy positions, which I will briefly summarize. One is the pursuit of a durable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, in which Israelis and Palestinians realize the vision of a just peace. And that should be realized through the vision of two viable states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side within secure and recognizable borders. To pursue the end of the Israeli occupation to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The recognition of settlements as illegal and an impediment to peace. The promotion of a shared Jerusalem by Palestinians and Israelis, and the free access to holy sites by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The promotion of justice and trauma healing and multi-level peace-building efforts with a particular recognition of the role of women. The upholding, as previously mentioned, of churches and organizations to participate in nonviolent means of ending the occupation, including using economic leverage. Support the right of engagement in nonviolent resistance. Recognition of religious importance of the Middle East to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and the encouragement of negotiated resolutions to all conflicts, the opposing of anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, and anti-Islamic actions and all other forms of racism or bigotry. These 13 points provide the guidance for CMUP amid constantly changing political landscape in the Middle East, and determine a rubric for which issues a CMUP should extend its resources on.
speak your mind? Anything? Yes.
Oh, well, for the professor, question about security. I mean, you talk about having a neutral Palestinian state, you know, akin to Switzerland and so forth. I mean, I myself did my dissertation on Austrian neutrality during the Cold War. One of the things I noted there is that for any such model of permanent neutrality, it requires a stable society, a stable government. I don't quite see how, say, Hamas coming to power in a Palestinian state could guarantee neutrality. I mean, how do you intend to vouch for the security of any such Palestinian state, which with such actors in Palestinian society and the potential they have for violence?
Well, the goal is to create a viable economic entity, and the tunnel diggers and rocket, makers would have regular jobs in an economy. You have to, in all demilitarization, de-escalation of military conflict situations, whether it was South Africa or the IRA in Northern Ireland or in Colombia, there has to be a program to give the young men, usually, a way to reintegrate. Now, whether you also do a South African type of process of, let me see, it's a truth and reconciliation, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know, it's worked in some places, it hasn't in other places. But there has to be a comprehensive effort to delegitimize in your society those elements like Hamas and so on, who just want to continue the conflict. Now, one way of squeezing them, by the way, is to stop the funding that I'm talking about. Is that, right now they can siphon off from the international aid that the Palestinians are getting, especially in Gaza. They can essentially siphon off a certain amount of not only physical resources, but of monetary resources. Everybody who's got a salary has to pay a certain bribe, if you wish, to Hamas and so on. So once you start squeezing those resources and you give the young men an alternative, then I think the strength of these groups will diminish, and they will be discredited. And it's, you don't want to create a civil war kind of situation, but I think the whole thing might peter out in the way that the IRA has also petered out among the, in Northern Ireland and so on. It takes time, and you have to have a viable alternative, but I don't think it's impossible to do. But you're right, you couldn't have, I totally agree with you, you can't have a neutral state that's a failed state. I mean, it's got to have a leg to stand on its own, plus international support that recognizes that neutrality.
Actually, I have a question building on both of those. Why is it that we say that Palestine, it has to be economically, socially stable, and it can't be a failed state before it actually is an actual state, whereas we shouldn't be giving it aid at that point, whereas there are a lot of states that are failed. They're economically depressed, socially have social issues, and also receive a lot of aid from the UN. Why is it that those states are able to be states and we respect their sovereignty, but Palestine has to, if you understand what I'm saying?
No, I don't understand. I don't understand what you mean. You mean the international community ought to support a failed state forever, and it will remain failed, and it will engage in violence?
I'm saying, why are there different levels of, we allow certain states to exist as states, and and we don't give them that kind of same standard that we're applying to Palestine. You can think about it. You don't have to answer, but I'm just play devil's advocate.
I don't follow your way of
What's
thinking.
an example?
I don't want to say, but I'm just saying, there are a lot of countries that receive high levels of funding from the UN and, have terrorist elements and many things like that, but we still say they actually are a state. We respect their sovereignty, they're allowed to be a state, all of these reasons. But with Palestine, we tend to say, well, the standard must be so high, why is that?
I think many of us would argue that it's not so high. If you have a group that feels that Israel should not exist, has no right to exist, and the majority of people feel that way, how can you negotiate and have any confidence that even if you agree?
No, I'm just playing devil's advocate with you. I'm just curious. Do you have a question?
For Mr. Wickersham. I'm trying to understand what your group does beyond talking. Internally, there's a lot of talk about theology, and you're trying to arrive at some ecumenical position. Externally, as your target would be the Middle East, you have a lot of proposals. Well, that's talk. But action, the only action I've heard about is that some of your members support VDX. Is there any other action that you're taking?
The majority of our action is focused on changing U.S. policy. So congressional advocacy, we do meetings with the State Department, and encouraging our domestic supporters to become engaged in presenting their concerns to their elected officials.
So you're a lobby.
We do some lobbying.
It's a 501. Sorry, I also work at Churches for Middle East Peace, so we're a 501c3, so we're not a lobbying group, but we do advocacy and education.
Any other questions or comments?
I'll just say something which I know will be provocative to this group, but I'm amazed in Washington. We come and people tell us what Hamas believes, tell us who the terrorists are, and yet we never take the opportunity to ask somebody in Hamas or somebody who's even spoken to somebody in Hamas what their actual positions are. Because your comment, for instance, is not consistent with the leaders of Hamas that I've spoken to. But your presentation was all about security. The Israelis are determined to have security.
I
But
talked
for-
about economic development.
Fair enough. But for me, who's been there many, many times and studied Jewish history and Jewish Zionism and the many different variants of Zionism, you mentioned Zionism, but you didn't mention Kufi, and you didn't mention that the political opponents of your Christian movement are the powerful ones in Washington. You didn't say a word about Jewish Zionist ideology, which is the real reason we don't have peace, the real reason the Israelis are expanding. Security's always been used as the ruse to explain away what their real policies are.
Well, I know where you're coming from. If you start talking about the Balkans and you say they've always hated each other, and all they're doing is renewing in this century all the hatreds and killings that they've done in past century, you go into Franco-German history, and
Well, that's not where I'm coming from. That's where you're coming from. I didn't say a word about
no. What I'm saying is that then what you do is you create a kind of a frame for looking at this conflict, which is just full of obstacles, and
That's why we don't have a settlement.
and you keep saying, well, if we do this, it will run into that obstacle. If we do this, it will run into obstacle, and nothing ever changes, and so on.
Because
And
if
I'm
you
just
don't face
suggesting
the
to you-
obstacles, you can't solve the problem.
And I'm just suggesting the South Africans faced up to it, the Germans and the French faced up to it. In fact, more recently, if you wish, the Protestants and the Catholics have faced up to it a lot more and have come to some kind of a settlement. So it's possible to do this. People like you say it's impossible to do it because
I
of
didn't say that.
Zionism,
I just said you're not
because
discussing
of
the real
racial
obstacles.
hatred, because
You
of this and
love to
that, the
put-
other thing.
You love to put words in people's mouth. I said
I'm
none of the
using
things
your
you
words.
said. What I did say was, you dealt not at all with the underlying ideological problems that are really responsible for the situation we're in. That's what I did say.
Yeah, and I'm saying that the ideological problems are not the main problems.
Fair enough, that's where the disagreement is. You don't believe those are important, I believe they're
Without,
central.
without these other things that I've mentioned.
What is the position of Hamas then? Elaborate.
Well, I have spoken to Abar Marzouk, the deputy head. I have spoken to Ahmed Yusuf. And actually, Ahmed Yusuf, for instance, who's been sort of their ideologist in Gaza, who used to be here in Washington before the Israeli lobby got Hamas declared a terrorist organization, and before Hamas won legitimately the elections, then he went back to Gaza. He actually gave me personally an amazing pamphlet called Toward a Binational State that he had written with Hamas support because he was trying to push Hamas in the direction that the Zionist movement had tried to push the Zionists in the 40s and 50s toward a binational concept, which is really what exists. You've got two nations there living. Do they live separately? Do they live one dominant? Or do they live binationally? I have found the Hamas people that I've spoken to, admittedly, they're not the fighters. They're the intellectuals. They're the academics. I have found them more dignified, more thoughtful, more aware of history than...
So, but would they say that Israel has a right to exist?
No more than the Israelis would say the Palestinians have a right of return. But would they say we can reach an agreement even if we don't fully agree about the other's rights? Yes, they would. The problem is not Palestinian rejectionism. The problem is Jewish and American rejectionism.
Did you want to ask a question or make a comment?
No, what I would like to say is that, you know, you talked to Hamas, I talked to the couple of the people high up in the Irish Republican Army when I was doing my work on Northern Ireland. And I've also talked to some of the Serb xenophobic nationalists. I was working on the Balkans in this particular time. And actually there's a lot more flexibility with people who ran on a platform at one time of killing the others and taking over to realizing in a new situation, yeah, maybe, you know, instead of having a military organization, now it's a political party that
Yes,
we should
America.
have, and that's the way to look at the future. So I'm not sure that if you talk to these Hamas people you've interviewed 5 years from now, that they will have the same view, or even in fact the Zionist settlers will have a constant, inflexible view given that things change and the circumstances change and opportunities change. So all
I
I'm
would
saying
suggest
is,
you talk to them, and there's something called Skype. You don't even have to pay their airplane ticket. You can just call them up and talk to them right now. But why doesn't a conference like this do that?
because this is just preparing the way for propaganda to be dished out. If you want some serious talks with people, you don't put them into the limelight in the media and say, okay, state your position.
That's
and
what
tell
our
us
media
why.
does every day ad infinitum. That's exactly what we're all subjected to daily.
Yeah.
Also, if two groups don't agree, the other group, we perceive it to be propaganda. So the Palestinians might say, well, actually, what the Israelis are saying is propaganda, and vice versa. So
Yeah, and words can lose their meaning. I mean, did you read George Orwell about how people use language and terminology? And
You mean Fox News?
and I just don't fall for that. I think that some things have a true meaning and an objective reality, and other things are closer to propaganda and so on. And for the people who don't believe in reality to say everything is propaganda, I think it's a totally losing proposition for this country too, by the way, and what's happening in our politics. That's what would be my answer to you.
any other questions or comments or challenges? Yes.
Well, I guess continuing on the theme of the peaceability of the Palestinians and any prospective future settlement, have you ever analyzed the work of Palestinian media watch watch PMW. It's headed up by an Israeli-American guy, Itamar Marcus. And I mean, as some of my Jewish friends have told me, you know, looking at the Palestinian media from their official clerics and their politicians and what's taught in the schools and so forth, that it sort of sounds like Der Stürmer from the Nazi Party and the Third Reich. I mean, it's filled with all these, you know, Quranic verses about Jews are descent from apes and pigs, and you know, the Hadith about citing the Hamas Charter, you know, the end times will not come until Jews, even the stones and the trees cry out, there's a, you know, fight the Jews, and there's a Jew hiding behind me, come kill him, and you know, the verse in the Quran about the worst of the enemies of Islam will be the Jews. And, I mean, just this stuff just pumped into the, you know, the kids' minds, and how, you know, all of the Holy Land, the former Palestine Mandate is occupied, Tel Aviv's occupied, and, you know, little kids being told, you know, I want to become a suicide bomber, and all this. I mean, how do you negotiate peace with such a group like that? I mean, the former Israeli chief of staff, Moshe Yalon Bogi, as his nickname is, he said, you know, look, way back when the Oslo Accords started, he said, look, this is not going to work. Why? Because he examined Palestinian textbooks, and they were just so filled with vitriol. It was just, you can't make peace with a people like that. I mean, have you, how does that factor in your?
You think that can't change? You think it's a law of nature, like the law of
Well,
gravity?
you would have to have a whole-scale cleansing of the society. I mean, a full-scale, I mean, comparable indeed to say the denazification of Germany. I mean, who's going to undertake that? Are they going to undertake that, or are they doing that? Or
I had actually an interesting experience. I have relatives in both Germany and France. So I'm not a born American. I'm an immigrant, and they've had children and now grandchildren, and I've actually looked at the school texts, both in France and in Germany. And what you describe is very much what they used to teach between the two wars, between in the 1930s and 40s. And now, if you actually look and talk to these young people who just going through secondary school, gymnasiums and so on, and you look at their textbooks, and actually the French have the French history books have a very accurate treatment of the Vichy government and the collaboration and what they did to the Jews in France, and how this, you know, was a blot on sort of on their history. They admit it. The Germans in their textbooks don't deny the Holocaust and you know, various other Nazi policies and so on. And the young people, you know, instead of sitting around talking about hatred, they like to watch soccer games together. You know, the European Cup games when a French and a German team play each other. So what I'm saying is that yes, things are absolutely horrible if you look at them at this particular moment, and that has to change. But it doesn't mean that it cannot change. That would be my way of answering. And who finances all of this kind of education? A lot of it comes from these outside sources. And once that dries up, and you can't make money out of hatred, out of promoting violence and hatred, then you know, you diminish the volume of that kind of stuff.
And what do you think of a one-state solution?
One-state solution. I mean, it's a totally different topic.
You mean like America?
However, yeah.
The Palestinians won't accept being a quasi-colony, okay? So that's part of my talk.
Or an integrated one state, an integrated where everyone is equal and there is no differentiation.
The Israelis want a Jewish state. They don't want an integrated, multinational,
A secular.
multi-religious, whatever state. And I think that they're right in doing that. So are the Palestinians, right, in having a separate state. I think that's viable. One state there, I just
So you
don't
don't
see
think
it.
it would be viable to have a one state? No.
What would be viable about it?
Well, I think it would probably be beneficial to the Palestinians in many ways.
It would be beneficial to the Israelis to have a majority of Palestinians in their Knesset and running the government. I mean, I don't see that as a realistic possibility. I mean, you're in La La Land, I think, really. I'm sorry to say that. Okay.
It's different ideological viewpoints, I think.
Well,
But isn't it interesting that we have this conflict even just in this room? And I mean, it's indicative of why there is this much larger, broader conflict, because it's just very difficult to agree on these issues.
yeah.
Yeah, very, very.
Have you been to the Kufi conference?
Really haven't.
Okay, I have. That's power. They're Christians. They're doing it in the name, and I know your movements oppose it, but your movements are primarily in the universities, you're primarily discussing things among yourselves. You don't have a power base in Washington, and Kufi has extraordinary power after only 7 or 8 years of organizing. They fill up the convention center with people from every state, with students, with church leaders. It's quite amazing what they've done. I know they've got AIPAC behind them.
Right. I mean, that's part of the reason that we need broad base, why we aim for such a broad base in our coalition is precisely because we need as much support as we can get. And part of that will mean engaging with Christian Zionism. If we ignore Christian Zionism, this won't work. We have to figure out a way to get Christian Zionism to be comfortable with the two-state solution.
You haven't been to their conferences. They
yeah.
wouldn't even know what you're talking about. They're off doing things. They're off lobbying. They're off electing people. They're off meeting with AIPAC. They're off sending their people to Israel. Their power base, just like the AIPAC power base when it comes to Jews, is extreme. The rest of us are quite irrelevant at this point, except when we talk to each other.
And you were talking about what is a just US policy for Israel and Palestine and the Middle East. I think that's a really interesting topic. Could you speak a little bit more about that and how it's also a deeply political issue and how the politics of the church and of the Middle East interact when you're defining what is a just
Right.
policy?
I mean, and that's why I brought in the issue of theology,
Yeah.
because, I mean, whenever you're addressing a term like justice, that implies an underlying value system.
Yeah.
And our different coalition members are going to be bringing different theologies into determining what
That's interesting.
justice is. And whether justice is something that can be determined rationally or whether it can only be revealed through faith or not. And so figuring out how to reconcile those diverse viewpoints is also something that has to be addressed.
Do you think there's an acknowledgement in defining what is just for those groups that it is theologically based, or do you think that there's a perception or a communication that it's actually objective justice?
Within several mainline denominations, there's the traditional view that reason, that rationality, that objective reality is a source of divine inspiration. So those denominations would not see a distinction.
Okay.
More fundamentalist leaning denominations would see a conflict potentially between faith-based and reason-based definitions of justice, and would be more uncomfortable with the idea of social justice being derived from Scripture.
It's really interesting.
And I would say, the 13 policy positions that that Andrew alluded to give sort of a view of what objective justice does look like. So I would, to answer your question, I do think, that there's an agreement that to arrive at an objective justice, it would be marked by these 13 policy positions.
Okay.
So it would be about equality, human rights, and justice for all residents of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. It would be about ending the settlements. It would be about ensuring, religious freedom for all, for Christians, Jews, and Muslims in Israel, Palestine, as well as the broader Middle East. So
Okay.
I think there is that objective.
It's very interesting. I think it's challenges? Or
Yeah, I guess,
it's an interesting panel, yeah.
talking about right of return, you know, you give this idea of, well, we'll compensate the Palestinians for right of return.
Right.
I mean, my friend, I'm blanking on his name all the time. The head of Maree, the Middle East Media Research Institute, you know, I was talking with him once, and he was saying, yeah, I would talk to people, the supporters of the Oslo Accords back in the 90s, and they were all for the two-state solution and so forth, and I would say to them, yeah, but what about the right of return? You know, the Palestinians, they want a right of return. They want all these millions of descendants of some 600,000 or so refugees from 48 war to be able to, which are now, you know, some 5 million or so, to be able to have a right to come into Israel from where their, you know, these ancestors came. And he always got the response from these Oslo Accord supporters, oh, that's just negotiating point. They're not really all that serious. It's not such a big deal. And then, but now, you know, he says, look, you know, you just hear right of return all the time. The BDS movement has, as of course, one of its demands, a right of return. That's one of the 3 demands of the BDS movement. So they said, you know, and he would say, and they would say, oh, it's no big deal. But you know, he said, what if they push it? I mean, it's just no one in Israel accepts that. That would indeed be the demographic death of Israel. I mean, do you see any possibility of Palestinians saying, oh, okay, now, you know, we'll just take some money or whatever and stay where we are?
Well, first of all, the polls that I've seen now for several decades would indicate that that's a majority of, vast majority actually, of the Palestinians would take a financial compensation for a right of return that they know has a 0 probability. The other thing is, during my Bosnian studies, there was a right of return. You know, there was major ethnic cleansing during the Yugoslav wars, and the Dayton Peace Agreement and other peace agreements did have a right of return of the ethnic population, but they also could trade that in for financial compensation for the properties that they've lost, and so on. And there was a commission set up to evaluate, first of all, to take applications about who claimed the right of return and how much that amounted to in terms of the property and so on. And I'd say about 3/4 of the Bosnians took some kind of compensation instead of the right of return. The right of return for them was not attractive because they would be now again in a minority situation in a place where the majority had driven them out, and where the local authorities would refuse to, you know, teach their culture and accommodate them and so on. So it's not a, now the politicians make a huge lot of propaganda and try to mobilize hatred among people and get them all excited about the right of return. But I think the people are more level-headed, and they don't necessarily buy that. But remember, the media are controlled by the politicians and not the people, so you see a lot of stuff that really represents opportunist political leadership viewpoints.
Okay, we have another question.
Well, actually, this is a comment, if I may. On this issue, I think it's a matter of apples and oranges when you try to compare polls about whether any particular Palestinians will be willing to sell their land as opposed to the right of return. The right of return is a matter of international law. It's something that cannot be traded away, cannot be given away. To say that Palestinians would sell their land given the opportunity is granting them their right to their property, and as owning that property, they can, if they wish, sell it. So before you can get to, we're going to buy your property from you, you have to first say, it's your property, you have a right to it, we can't take it away. And that's the issue of right of return. And until that's confronted directly, you're not going to get anywhere. As for the two-state solution, the Oslo Accords, I talked with some of the Palestinian legal representatives during that period between the Oslo Accords and what I consider to be the death of the two-state solution more recently. And I asked, why is that not being brought up? And they said, because the Americans say it'll be a death knell if we bring it up. They say it's a matter of international law, so don't bring it up. Wait until all the other issues are dealt with, and then at the end, the Israelis would have to give in on this. Well, in fact, that's not what happened, and I suspect it's not what the Americans said when they were with the Israelis.
Would you like to respond?
No, I'm not into the blame game and the obstacles to this and that. What I tried to put together is a plan that I think would be attractive for especially the young people who have to live out the rest of their lives rather than the old people, of what the future would be like under certain institutions and arrangements and economic and political changes. That's all. And it's not for me to choose this, not my future. It's the local people, both among Palestinians.
But I was following up on the question in your plan, and I apologize for coming in late.
Yes.
This panel was conflicting with the prayer time. But the question was, in your plan, do you recognize that right of return? In other words, when you make an offer to the Palestinians and say, we would like you to abandon your claim to this property and we'll pay you, we'll recognize that you have that right and we'll pay you for the property. Is that the approach? Or is the approach, look, you're not entitled to this property. We're going to give you a gift of some monetary compensation because we're not going to let you come back. That's two different things.
Okay, I would say that, if some Native American Indians living in Long Island claim Manhattan as a right of return, I would say, how far do you want to, push this kind of thing? How many generations? Do we start with Adam and Eve and what have you? I don't know. So
that's a fair question, but the Palestinians are pushing one generation and the Israelis are pushing several dozen.
Okay, but I think a compromise can be reached, as in the case of the Balkans and in other places, that there are people who are still old people and their children, and they have to get some kind of compensation for the losses that they realize. Now, in most wars and most conflicts, there is no compensation. It's like my family, who were kicked out of Hungary. I got no compensation. In fact, I demand no compensation. But there are other situations where it's reasonable to say, I think, for the sake of peace in the future, that you should get some compensation. Now, whether it's in international law or whether some high court says it's not true for 3 generations, but it's only true for 1 generation, doesn't make a difference. You have to get people to agree that that's the future and not to take up weapons. And how do you, and if it takes some compensation to do that, I say compensate. That's all. That's my answer.
Thank you. But through compensating, isn't Israel admitting that they are an occupying power?
No, they are the occupying power under international law.
I mean, in a negative way.
In what?
In a negative way.
In a negative way.
You'll have to push harder.
Trying to be diplomatic.
Actually, Israel has offered compensation to
reality.
some of the people in return for their signing a statement that they have no right to the land. That's not the same thing as selling your land.
If you go into the West Bank, the Israeli Defense Forces are there. So what? Is that a mirage? They're an occupying power. So what's...
You missed his point, which was very important. The Israelis claim Eretz Yisrael based on something called the right of return. They've given me, as a Jew, and you, the right of return based on biblical days. Now you want to deny the Palestinians the right of return from just a generation or two ago, which happens to be validated by international law over and over again. So from a Palestinian point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense to them.
Yeah, well, I don't give the right of return to the Mongols to come back and reoccupy the empire that they had.
Why
Why
don't
don't
you
you
give it
deal
to
with the
Samuel
Jews' right of return?
Scheinbein
You
that
do
he
give
was
the
able
Jews
to-
the right of return,
He was
right?
able to go back to Israel even though he hasn't had ancestors there for who knows how many
The
generations.
Jews get the right of
But
return
my
from
mother
biblical
was born in
days,
Jerusalem,
but
and
not
I
the
can't go
Palestinians
back.
from their grandfathers' days.
Biblical days.
Okay, well, it's time has finished. Actually, it has. Thank you